really what I want to do is show you around in the software and get you familiar with what that looks like from a daily usage perspective and an administrative perspective. But first, we'll go ahead and set the stage here. I like to open up with this quote here from a very highly distinguished Gartner security analyst. Her name is Aviva Latan. She's still at Gartner. She does a lot of work currently. And we work closely with them as well in this space. And one of the things that she said recently, this was in a report in 2012, was anything that involves your most serious intellectual property is typically contained and secured enough so that attackers will need privileged accounts to get in. And the way we interpret this is that she's basically saying the controls and the mechanisms that we have in place today, whether it be your external firewalls, your DLPs, your IDS and IPS, your database security and application firewalls, all those mechanisms that we've put in place for our most critical assets, for our most secured assets, the ones that are very deepest within our firewall, at some point in the chain of an attack or an advanced persistent threat, somebody's going to need a privileged account, whether it be a privileged account on a local user's workstation that lets them do a remote code execution vulnerability and get a remote command and control Trojan installed, or whether it be a privileged account on a networking device that they can use to relax a firewall rule or move through into a database, et cetera. So at some point in that chain, they're not just going to be able to access vulnerabilities. They'll need a valid set of credentials and one with privileges. So that's, I like to open with that because I think that really summarizes what we're after. That summarizes our goals. We're here to help you protect those privileged types of accounts. We'll talk about exactly which accounts those are here in just a second. I'm going to go over some statistics really quick. I'm sure you guys are familiar with Mandiant as a company. Been around for a really long time. They do post-attack analysis for really big attacks that happened during the year. And specifically, they did one in 2013 for attacks that happened in 2012. So this is 1 year behind. But basically, summarizing some of these numbers, 54% of the systems that they analyzed, the systems that Mandiant looked at that were attacked, and them figuring out how they were compromised, only 54% of those systems contain malware. So if you're just looking at the presence of malware on your system, if you're just looking for that infected code, you're not getting the whole story there. These guys are able to infiltrate either via a workstation or some other lower privileged asset to gain access remotely to a higher privileged asset without actually executing code on that. So if you're solely relying on AV, you're probably not getting the whole story. And then in light of not getting the whole story, this next figure, 94% of breaches were reported by third parties. I think it's pretty obvious, and we've probably known for a while that we're not looking at the data in the right way sometimes. And I don't want to speak in blanketed statements here, but there may be abilities and ways that we can look at the data in a little, through a different angle or from a different pane of glass to get a better insight into what that stuff is telling us. It's obviously much more beneficial if we can discover these vulnerabilities on our own and not need to be told about it. 243 days is the median number of days that an attacker spends on the network. So again, with the data we're getting back, whether it be data that's leaving in the form of a DLP solution, scanning or assessing the data that's leaving, or it's some sort of IDS or IPS, or it's just your SIEM solution in terms of login and security events that happen, we're not analyzing that in the right way to get these attackers off of our network in a quick enough time. And we'll talk about what we think is one of the reasons for that, right? Obviously, it's privileged accounts. That's what we're here to talk about. We'll talk about why exactly. And then again, this last figure, 100%, you don't see too many statistics with the number 100 attached to them. 100% of breaches that they analyzed from 2012 involved some sort of stolen credentials. More often than not, stolen privileged credentials, and even worse, stolen privileged shared credentials. We'll talk about what that means here in just a little bit. So actually, we'll address that right now. So which types of accounts are we talking about when we talk about privileged credentials? For starters, the easiest one, I think, to explain here, shared interactive admin accounts. These are things like local administrator on your Windows system, root on your Linux box, SA that's built into a SQL database, sys on an Oracle database. These are all accounts that have very high level of permissions on these systems, and almost anything you receive as a company or deploy, whether it's hardware, software, services, it will always have some sort of built-in privileged credential. And the takeaway with that credential is that not only is it very highly privileged, but the amount of control that you regulate with it today is, or potentially, right? Not going to assume to know, But in often cases, we find that it's not necessarily the most guarded or protected credential within an organization. So for instance, it's not uncommon for us to approach organizations that have a local administrator password, for instance, on all of their Windows servers that's the same value, and it has been for 2 or 3 years. And when you start to look at that, you think about how many people have come and gone from an organization and may still know that value. That's what we want to protect and isolate against. And I know there's ways you can do that with group policy and push out new values. We'll talk about exactly why that's dangerous as well. But the shared admin interactive accounts, I think, are typically the easiest ones to understand and digest. So again, you're looking at shared administrator accounts for Windows, the built-in root credential on Linux, SA account for databases. The list goes on. The next column here is application-to-application accounts. The example that I like to paint here is a .NET application, .NET stack that talks back to a SQL web server, or I'm sorry, a SQL database. And in some scenarios, or in most scenarios, that .NET application in some way has a credential to access that data store, whether it's typed in pre-compile and it's then hard-coded into the application, whether it's in a web config or an INI. Even if it's encrypted, in some way it lives on that web server or that web stack in multiple servers, and it's typically accessible. And the reason that we highlight these specifically is that the nature of these accounts makes them very difficult to change as well. So you stand up an application, you're at steady state, maybe you're doing routine maintenance on it, but maybe it just involves too much downtime to change that credential. That credential that the application is using to access the data store is also very highly privileged. By the nature of that, it has unrestricted access in most scenarios to the data store so that the application can access all the data. Doesn't necessarily mean that the users that are logging into the application, it's a web app, have access to all the data, but that credential that the application is using to access the data store typically does. So if somebody were to get their hands on it, there's some malicious things they could do with that, whether it be data exfiltration or maliciously harmful things to those systems. Another one I want to mention in this column here is service accounts, right? Service accounts for Windows, service accounts for Unix. They're all more or less the same, where we typically, when we create those service accounts, we do the bad practice of checking that box that says password never expires. And then maybe we have a service that's running with elevated or administrative permissions on a Windows system for 2, 3, 10 years, right? It's hard to say without changing that credential. And, a lot of solutions currently, especially identity access management solutions, and this is where we like to separate ourselves from that, because we're not. We're specifically focused on managing privileged accounts and shared accounts typically. Identity access management solutions will help you assess what permissions they have in terms of the domain, potentially assess which permissions they have with local machines. We typically find that they fall short in terms of service accounts, and that's where we like to pick up specifically in that column, is assessing those service accounts, providing a method for people to check in or check out access if they need access to those accounts, as well as keeping that password fresh and rotated without breaking any dependencies on other systems. And of course, we'll go into how we do that here in just a second. And then finally, this last column here, cloud accounts. In my eyes, this spans kind of 2 subcategories here. It's either your infrastructure, SaaS as a service, software as a service, platform as a service, things that you would potentially migrate portions of your infrastructure to and potentially stored sensitive information, whether it's a backup solution, cloud backup solution, whether it's hosted infrastructure in the form of virtual machines or whatever, Amazon Web Services. And then the other column of that, in terms of cloud accounts, could also be things like your marketing presence, right? Maybe you have a Facebook account or a Twitter account that's specifically dedicated to your company, and although it's not storing intellectual property, and although it's not it's probably not a target for somebody that's trying to steal the next big medical plan, it's still a concern from a branding perspective. It's still something that affects your brand, something that you want to get control of, and more often than not, it's a marketing team that's controlling access to those credentials who may or may not have the best security policies or practices in mind. We saw a couple of these examples specifically last year as Twitter's exploded as a brand representation with things like the Associated Press hack. There was a popular fast food restaurant. There was a popular car manufacturer. And again, I don't want to call out any names here, but But the cases happen, right? And it's something that we want to help you isolate and protect. So again, the goal with those in terms of cloud accounts is when the service doesn't offer you the ability to connect back to single sign-on or connect back to Active Directory, you have that one credential, as is the case, of course, with Facebook and Twitter. You have those one single credentials that need to be controlled. Many people may be sharing them. You want a place to audit who has access and be able to assert your accountability for that specific credential. So I think we'll probably, in this demonstration, this discussion, we'll definitely spend much more time on the first column here in terms of shared interactive admin accounts. Those we think are obviously the biggest win, the low-hanging fruit from a rollout and deployment perspective, and it's the ones we'll spend more time on here. But definitely, if you have questions about any of the other two columns, feel free to reach out or let us know. Or you can ask questions. I think there's a chat function that's available here for you guys to ask questions, and we'll do a quick Q&A at the end of the call. So we actually do our own investigation here. We do our own surveys with our customers, and one of these surveys that we did was of companies greater than 5,000 employees. So these are already CyberArk customers, and they all have greater than 5,000 employees, so relatively large customers. And it could be up to 40,000, up to millions of employees with certain defense contractors, et cetera. So in companies of greater than 5,000 employees, we asked them, in your estimation, how many privileged accounts exist within your organization? And we get some interesting results here. So 1 to 250, typically we say that that's, I don't want to say inaccurate right off the bat, but what we consider in terms of a privileged account, each of the workstations that you have for every employee has a local administrator account that's built into that. And it may or may not, if it was compromised, it may or may not provide somebody the full keys to the kingdom, but in terms of an advanced persistent threat, it's definitely a good start, especially if that local administrator account is the exact same password across all your workstations. Then it's a really good start, right? If they try it on the next workstation and it works, then arguably it's jackpot, right? So even though it's not the administrator account on your PCI or SOC specific database, it's still an account that you want to protect and isolate, and it's still something that potentially the whole help desk infrastructure in your organization shares. So it's hard to attribute accountability. If John from your help desk were to log in and do activity A, you don't know whether that was John because he logged in as administrator. He used that local administrator credential, as is often the case with help desk type scenarios, right? Maybe the machine fell off the domain. Maybe we need to reformat a drive. Maybe we need to change hardware. We're typically using that shared type credential. So long story short, we think that the 100 or 1 to 250 column, we may need to have a little bit further discussions with those people. The 5,000 plus is probably getting a little more realistic. Again, you have 5,000 employees, 5,000 workstations, so we would consider that at least 5,000 accounts. And then the don't know, we think, are probably obviously the most honest and probably the most realistic, right? It's hard to assess how many of these exist. We've been naming just a handful here, and we'll talk more about other platforms that we support, but things that are typically excluded that we also support are things like your hypervisor infrastructure, your virtual infrastructure. So if it's KVM, if it's VMware, if it's Hyper-V, they all have privileged accounts built in. Again, all of your networking infrastructure. Yes. Hello? Oops, sorry, I heard something. All of your networking infrastructure and devices, those have built-in highly privileged accounts as well. So, so we want to be able to help you assess and get a foothold of where those accounts exist. So how can CyberArk help? Well, first of all, I'm not going to go too far into the company here. I want to just skip through that. I want to talk about where exactly we would sit in the infrastructure. We're not going to go too deep into architecture here, but I want to talk at a high level what the solution would look like if deployed. This is more of a logical diagram than an architecture diagram, but at the top here you have all of your job roles, or a subset of them at least. You have Windows admins, Unix admins, DBAs. There's multiple admins or multiple IT type roles, and then your auditors at the end there, all potentially needing access to a specific system for a certain reason, for their own reason, and for also valid reasons, right? And it may be through a shared credential that they get access, or it may be through their own network ID, right? Maybe it's their Active Directory or LDAP credential that they're gaining that permission from. If it's through a shared credential, the point here is that it's really hard to ungive a password once you've given a password. So what I mean by that is, let's say we have 10 people on the Windows operations team that are responsible for managing our Windows Server infrastructure. They all know the local administrator passwords of those systems. Once they know that, we can't unknow it unless we change the password. And if one of them leaves the company, it's difficult for us to manage and maintain that. So multiple valid reasons that they can need access to these systems, and it becomes more or less an unmanageable task when you try and assess through shared credentials who has what. So that's exactly where we'd sit, right? Right in the middle. We would want to broker this access. We would want to isolate and audit. So anything that a user did, you know, again, if one of your Windows admins needs to check out a shared credential for whatever reason, he would come to the CyberArk password vault, which we'll talk about in just a second. He would access that server, and then your auditor would have full access to the logs, potentially the logs of the session, maybe even video recording, right? We'll talk about how we can layer on additional methods of security here. Maybe even it's a DVR recording of that session and exactly what that user did. It could also just be the entry saying, hey, that user checked out the password, we need to go out and change it. So hopefully this kind of paints a picture of exactly where we sit within the organization and what we intend to help out with. And again, there's some more of the systems at the bottom. So this definitely isn't specific to Windows and Unix, right? It spans into databases, networking infrastructure, even I-series and Z-series mainframes. I'm sure some of you guys on the call have some older or even newer mainframe infrastructure, AS400s, security appliances, and even websites and web applications. So even if it's not cloud web applications like Twitter and Facebook, it could be local web, web front ends to GUIs, like I know a lot of Oracle e-business suite and Hyperion and ClearPay, and then even Juniper firewalls have that, Palo Alto firewalls, et cetera. So it could be local web presence as well. So before we get into the product, and we'll get into that here in just a minute, I want to offer 4 critical steps to stopping advanced threats here from a privileged account perspective. Hopefully we've highlighted the problem. Hopefully we've kind of talked about how some of these attackers would use these to step through the network. I mean, I think that is pretty obvious, whether it's a local vulnerability that's exploited on a user's workstation and they use a pass-to-hash attack to gain access to other credentials. Most of the time they're using these privileged credentials to gain or keep foothold throughout the network as they move through. And then ultimately, as was shown in the first slide, they'll need some sort of privileged amount with a valid credential to access that most sensitive information that they're looking for. So how can we help? 4 steps. Obviously, discovering your privileged accounts is a very big need, right? Understanding the landscape, knowing what that looks like. We have a utility that we can run called DNA. It's a really simple utility. It's a single executable that runs on one workstation. You provide it credentials, and it reaches out to the directory, populates machines, and then reaches out to the individual machines and scans those. And what it's looking for, again, is not so much around the domain membership and permissions, but it's really scanning each individual machine to assess what the landscape is there. So it's looking for local accounts, looking for maybe domain accounts that are in the local administrators group on that system, things that are running services, things that are running scheduled tasks, IIS app pools, Com Plus applications, registry entries, the list goes on, right? So it's looking for information at the local machine from the WMI table to get a good assessment of what your security posture is for accounts across the board, right? Not just at the domain. This utility is for Windows and Unix. So it's also on the Unix platform. Similar in the Unix platform, just kind of rotate out some of those terms, right? It's looking for things in accounts in the sudoers file, accounts in the wheel group, accounts with extended permissions, and the ability to SU, or the ability to operate at a higher level set of permissions. And basically what this report tells you is things that are where those credentials are, when the last time the password was rotated, when the last time it was accessed and used, which services it's running, which scheduled tasks, which daemons, et cetera. So really good utility, really good to get a handle on from an initial perspective where these privileged accounts are, where they lie, and what kind of vulnerability they could be causing. I think the record so far is an account that hasn't been changed in 5,500 days, which is, at the advent of NT, I think that one's been carried along for a while. That's know, 15 years. But anyway, we find some very, very interesting things when we scan this at customer sites, and it's revealing for them as well. So, so this is a good utility to kind of help discover some of those. Secondly, so protect and manage account credentials. So once we've discovered them, what do, right? What's our next step? We want to make sure that we're protecting them. So what we mean by protect is obviously store them in a secured location, right? Not the Excel spreadsheet on SharePoint. Store them somewhere where we know is secure, that nobody can get access to unless they go through a specific channel and follow specific workflows. And then manage as well. So protecting is only half the story. If the password's still static, if that credential still stays the same for years, then once we expose it to somebody, we can't ungive it, right? So we need to manage that credential as well. We need to apply a policy, change it every 30 days, change it every 60 days, maybe even change it after every use. And we're really starting to see a big shift in the industry from, you know, we purchase and implement products like CyberArk because we just want to stay within the bounds of our security or regulatory compliance, right? So it used to be a lot of PCI, SOX, HIPAA, and of course we can still help you meet those requirements. But the big shift we're seeing now is it's just becoming security best practice, right? It's just, and that's in light of a lot of the 2013 attacks and even early 2014 attacks that are obviously more in the media and more prevalent. So it's becoming, and obviously always has been, just a good security practice to make sure you have a handle on how your users, how humans, whether it's your internal users or external users, are getting access to systems, not just from their credential, not what set of permissions they have in Active Directory or what set of permissions we've given them on the target system, but how they're getting access to those systems through shared type credentials. And how do we manage that? And how do we control who uses those and what they do? So protecting and managing those credentials is obviously key. The method in which we do that here is we actually have a patented and hardened operating system, what we call our secure digital vault. And it's responsible for maintaining all those credentials. Again, if you're going to move things from that spreadsheet on SharePoint, you want to make sure you're moving them to a place that's as secure, if not more secure. Obviously, this is more secure. So the only thing that communicates with this operating system from a server level are CyberArk components, right? So maybe things like the website front end, which we isolate from that. Maybe things like the central policy manager, which actually reaches out to systems and changes the password. But the takeaway here is that security was at front of mind when developing the secure digital vault. So it's an encryption structure with multiple layers of encryption before you finally get to the password object itself. It's FIPS 140, AES 256, et cetera. So just to kind of build some confidence that when you do take these credentials and move them from a place that's you know, maybe a little more vulnerable or a little less audit to a new place, you want to make sure it's secured. And then thirdly here, control, isolate, and monitor access to privileged servers and databases. So this is kind of that extra layer of security I was talking about, right? We've gone through the first two. We've discovered all of our privileged accounts, and we're now protecting and managing them from a server level. You know, we're making sure we apply policy to them and updating new values. Thirdly, we want to control, isolate, and monitor. So what I mean by that is we have the ability to isolate sessions when users connect to sessions. And this may make a little more sense when I show you the software here in a second, but send connections through a proxy to either catch a DVR recording, pull out a full text log of what was done, make sure that our connections are isolated so that people can't map files from one drive to another. This is a layer of security that you may not put on all your systems, but maybe your most sensitive systems, right? Maybe you have a segregated network that's a NERC SIP with, you know, NERC SIP required with SCADA type industrial controls, or maybe you have an isolated network that has patient information and it's HIPAA regulated, or maybe PCI, right? Or maybe it's just, you know, internal data that you want to make sure you secure and isolate connections to that system. So this is an additional layer of security, what we call Privileged Session Manager, that you would add on top of vaulting the account. And if an individual needs to utilize that account to connect to a system, it would be a recorded session, or it would be a text log audit, et cetera. And we'll show what that looks like here in just a second. And then lastly, here's a sort of quick architecture of what that looks like. I think it'll make sense here in a little bit. But But basically, the takeaway, the point to emphasize here on this is that the credential would never actually reach the end user system, never exposed to the end user. And that's also a good practice, so that if you don't provide them the password, but you're still operationally allowing them to connect to the system to perform their task, then they're not really concerned what the password is. It doesn't matter, right? So we can set it to 64 bits or 64 characters of special values, commas, parentheses, etc. And it can be that very difficult password to uncover because they're not really concerned with the values. We're automatically connecting them to the system. And the PSM, or the session manager, communicates directly with the vault to retrieve that credential. So the credentials are never exposed to the end user. And again, some of the connection methods that are supported, obviously this isn't a full list, but things like Toad, SQL+, RDP, HTTPS going to websites, SSH. So regardless of what your administrator prefers as a connection method, we can support that, right? If your DBAs say, I actually would rather use SQL Server Management Studio to connect to this database, we can automatically launch that, pass in the credentials without exposing it to them, and then provide them a recorded session with SQL Server Management so they have that native look and feel. And we'll show that here in just a second. And then lastly, of course, all logs can be shipped off to a SIM solution or syslog solution to kind of aggregate those logs, correlate those back with events that happen at target system, and assign real users, real humans to activities that have happened with shared accounts, right? So typically in your SIM solution, if somebody did something as the administrator account, right? If somebody did something as that, you would just see administrator did this. It's a really hard time attributing access or attributing accountability to that. So that's where we come in. At that SIM solution, we'll help you correlate those two between a human user and a shared account, and you can attribute access and investigate issues appropriately. And then fourth, so lastly, once you've isolated, once you've monitored, once you've vaulted these credentials and you've set up controls in place to allow users to access them, we want to use some sort of real-time privileged analytics. So we actually have a product for that called Privileged Threat Analytics. And in your normal day-to-day usage, shipping these logs off to a SIM solution, you can garner a lot of new insight in correlating the privileged account usage back to real human users. But how do you know when something's not correct, right? How do you know what do I need to look for from a security posture to say, hey, that's something you may want to investigate? And that's exactly where Privileged Threat Analytics comes in. I probably won't go too far into that today. At a high level, what it is it's a behavioral adaptive engine that just looks at the stream of privileged usage within your organization. So who's logging in as root, who's logging in as administrator, who's logging in as SA, and let's assess that. Should they have those capabilities? Should they have those or that level of access? And if somebody accesses a system like that outside of CyberArk, I'm going to throw the big red alert, right, and say, hey, somebody was able to gain access to the system utilizing this account, but they did not come through your normal control. And that would be the events that you want to pay attention to. With all that, I think we'll go ahead and jump over to a demo, and I want to show you what some of this stuff looks like inside the software. So first of all, what we'll do is I'll go ahead and launch the web UI. I want to make sure the resolution should be good here. If you have any issues reading anything or seeing anything, feel free to chat that over in the question box here. But all of your interaction with the system, whether it's an administrator needing to gain access to a privileged credential, whether it's an auditor coming in to pull a report, whether it's a vault admin, which is what we call people that administer the CyberArk product, there's a vault admin defining new workflows. All of that will happen from the web UI. So we'll go ahead and launch the web UI, and I'll show you what that looks like. The use case I'm going to walk through here first will be my Windows administrator, John. Right, and John's he's on the Windows Server Operations team, so he needs to gain access to servers, to apply patches, to troubleshoot issues, guarantee network connectivity, et cetera. So operationally, John's job is to just make sure those servers are functional. In this case here, he needs to log in for whatever reason to check out a shared credential. There's multiple forms of authentication. We want to tie this authentication back to typically LDAP, but definitely something that maintains a user store on your side, because this is where that accountability originates from. So when as soon as John logs in with LDAP and his Active Directory credentials, we know that any activity that happens during that session is attributed to John. So We can also put multiple layers of authentication on top of that, so it can be LDAP plus RSA Secure ID plus PKI plus smart card, whatever it may be. So we go ahead and log in as John here. Again, these are his Active Directory credentials. In an ideal scenario, I'd like to whittle this down to where John literally only needs to know one set of credentials. If he ever needs to log in to check out another set, for whatever reason, right, and these reasons always pop up, then he's doing it through here. So he only needs to know his AD credentials. Once he's logged in, John will see things that are specific to his job role only. So again, John's a Windows admin. He has some interesting job functions as well. We've given him access to some web applications, and apparently he also runs our marketing department because he has Twitter and Facebook access here as well. But most importantly, again, John's a Windows admin, and you'll see when I log in with some other people that not only will they not have access to these accounts, they won't even know they exist. So it's a complete segregation of duties. If you have access to Windows type accounts, that'll be the only thing you have access to. And you can make those groupings, obviously, however you want to. But long story short here, let's say that John needs to connect as an administrator, as the administrator, right? Not an administrator, the actual administrator account to a Windows box called Components. If he needs to check out that credential for any reason, he can simply just click the Connect button here on the far right. We'll automatically launch RDP, and we'll automatically pass those credentials in for John. He's sitting here at that target system. He's not logged in as John, he's logged in as administrator, right? That's what he intended to do. He needed to connect to this machine as administrator. And he's now got the ability to perform whatever functions he needs as an administrator in a secure and isolated manner, right? So one of the things you'll notice was that we never exposed that password to him. So John never had to see the value of the password. We've automatically connected it to that system. And again, where that adds benefit is if he's not concerned about what the value of the password is, we can make it the 64 or 128 characters, those really long, complicated passwords, and keep it updated and applied in the back end. And still give John operationally a method to connect and do what he needs to do. So I'm going to go ahead and log off here, assuming John has performed his task here. The next one I want to show really quick is we talked about two different methods of connecting to systems. One would be connecting the user from his local computer. The next one would be pushing him through a proxy, right? So we're actually now isolating the session in our 4 steps to control, monitor privileged accounts. The second one, or the third one after Discover and Vault, was isolate the session and monitor what happens. So let's say this was a PCI-specific server, and we actually want to know exactly what John did on that server. So instead of connecting his workstation, we now have the ability to push him through a proxy and record and isolate everything he's doing with the shared account. This one happens to be a domain account. This first one was a local account. So now with this domain account, it's going to ask me which box I can connect to. We're going to connect them to the domain controller here. And again, same look and feel here. We'll go ahead and spin up that RDP session, automatically pass those credentials in. One thing that you'll notice about this one that's going to be a little bit different is this notification here. CyberArk Privilege Session Manager, this session's being recorded, and it kind of popped up a little fast and then went away as the user was connected. But basically, it's informing the user that the activities he does during this session will be recorded and monitored. This, even not only from a DVR perspective, right, and we'll show what this looks like from the digital video recording, but also from an isolated event perspective. And so what I mean by that is, let's say that John were to come in here and launch a command prompt, and John were to type in ipconfig or netstat, or let's say cd to c, and then maybe John were to come in here and launch Active Directory users and computers. And again, we're just doing a couple of examples here so that we can see how we pull out and isolate these events. And then, even though John doesn't have permission, he's actually trying to create a new user on here. And he walks through that workflow. I'm not actually going to create the user. Go ahead and log off. I want to show what that looks like from an auditing perspective. So we've kind of demonstrated here how easily it is for John to get connected. We'll go through a lot more use cases in this UI right here. But what I want to do really quick is log out of John and log back in as an auditor and kind of show what that looks like from an auditor's perspective. So I'm going to log in as Mike here. He's an auditor on the system, and he actually has access to this monitoring tab. And inside of that monitoring tab, he has the ability to search for recorded sessions. So you can search for any session that John had, right? And we'll see here that, yeah, John actually logged in and used, via RDP, he used the X_admin account to connect to this box, CyberArk-demo. And we recorded that session. The session lasted for about 1 minute and 18 seconds. And we can click here to play back that full video. So again, John may have access on his account, right? But if John, for whatever reason, needs to utilize some sort of shared, highly privileged account, we've only talked about the Windows realm so far. We'll go a lot further. If John needs to access that shared account, we want to make sure we manage and isolate what exactly he's doing with that shared account and why he's not using his account, right? If John, in fact, is a Windows admin, he should have the permissions he needs maybe on his specific named account. So let's get a handle on why he's using other shared accounts. So let me go ahead and close this out. Obviously, this is a full DVR recording of what I just did. But let's say we needed to search for something specific, right? Let's say that John, again, in that scenario, we know that a new user was created at some time on a domain controller, and we want to figure out who did it. I can actually search for terms here from isolated events. And I can pull back and see when I search for new user at our latest session here, today at 11:36 a.m., John actually connected and he launched MMC to Active Directory users and computers. And then just after that, he launched the new user or new object user command. And we can jump straight to that point in video. We see that happened at about, let's see what the time was, about 1 minute and 10 seconds into the session. We can jump straight to that point in video and see John click on it and exactly what he did there. And we have that full attestation and full accountability for those actions with that shared account. So we really, like I said, we really focused on Windows primarily here. So I want to branch out and show what some other systems and formats look like. We strive from a PM effort, from a product management perspective, to be completely system agnostic. I think Windows tells the biggest story. I think most people can relate to Windows and understand how there's a big landscape of shared accounts, but obviously it doesn't stop there. And in fact, you know, almost all of our customers utilize this for multiple platforms. So for instance, I log in as Paul, and Paul is my Unix admin. And so again, we mentioned John had access to Windows type accounts. Paul, based on his role again and based on his permissions in Active Directory, will have access to Unix type accounts. And just to kind of demonstrate that Paul wouldn't see anything non-relevant to his role, if I do a search for Windows here, Paul sees nothing, right? There's nothing that comes back from Windows. If I search for Unix, he's got a ton of accounts here. The ones that are showing up are only the ones initially flagged as his favorites. So maybe there are a subset of accounts that he works with frequently. If he's recently used them, he'll see them under the recently used tab. So we also want to make this operationally as easy as possible on your end users. We want to make sure that your administrators, because their ultimate job is to keep those servers up and supported, want to make sure that they can easily connect to those systems. So if we go back here to favorites, and again, same scenario here, Paul wants to utilize a shared credential. He needs to utilize the actual root credential to connect and manage the system. He simply clicks the connect button. In this scenario, you'll notice something just a little bit different, right? Obviously, it starts with the same RDP type session, and then we'll launch an SSH prompt form and connect him directly to that Unix system. Same notification here, session manager, this session's being recorded. The thing that's different here that you'll notice is in this Unix environment, we've actually not allowed root to log on. It's pretty common practice. It's a good practice from a security perspective that you don't want the actual root account to be able to log on to an SSH session. You'd rather have somebody log on as another account and then SU over to root. So we've done that automatically here for Paul. So when Paul needs to utilize a root credential, we don't have to break our existing policies that say, well, now I need to allow root to log on. CyberArk can actually harness the scripting here and pass in a logon account, which actually happens to be named logon, pass that in automatically with the password, and then SU automatically to root and pass in the root password, and do that all transparently to the end user. So although Paul kind of saw this action unfold, he didn't have access to any of those passwords. He wasn't revealed any of those, and he's now sitting at a root prompt, and he's able to do whatever he needs to do with this prompt. So again, we can type a couple commands here. I want to show what the auditing and command level auditing looks like for this. And then we're actually coming up on our time. big. I want to leave some time for questions here. So we'll move kind of fast. So yeah, so almost an identical scenario as with the local administrator account for Windows or a domain administrator account for Windows. This is Paul getting connected with a Unix machine. I'm going to do one more before we jump over and look at that recording. Maybe confusing the waters here with a couple of different job roles, but Robert is my DBA. So Robert would have access to database type accounts. He would only have access to those. He wouldn't have access to OS level accounts on Windows or Unix. Robert, his job role is a database administrator. So when he logs in, again, he sees his favorites. We have 3 accounts listed in here. These are some of the ones I mentioned here at the beginning of the call. So the SYS account that's built in for Oracle databases, and the SA account that's built in for SQL databases. Here's an HR account. This happens to be an application ID that's utilized by an application. One of the things that I don't want to forget, and I briefly touched on it throughout the discussion through the slides, was that behind the scenes here, you know, not only are we giving the user a way to connect to the server and connecting him automatically using his client of choice, but behind the scenes, we've got a policy that changes this account password based on our definition, right? So maybe every 10 days, maybe every 30 days, it may be after every use, it may be after every 5 uses, right? Whatever we define as a policy, the system's automatically reaching out to the system and changing that credential. It's probably a good place to note here as well that is agentless, does not require an agent on the target system. So if we're on the target system, you know, let's say we're managing an account at a database, we don't have to go install agents that manage that credential. We're using native protocols to reach out and change that credential and do it automatically behind the scenes. So let's go ahead and show what this would look like from Robert's perspective. So Robert needs to utilize this HR account to sign into a database. He simply clicks connect, and again, same look and feel, right? It's going to notify him that the session is being recorded. It's going to pass in the credential automatically, and he's now sitting at a prompt to do whatever management he needs to do here, and obviously that's recorded. One important thing to note here, especially applicable to DBAs, is that frequently your database guys have a preference in terms of a client or the way that they want to connect to a system. So some of them use tools like SQL Developer or Toad or SQL Plus or SQL Server Management Studio, and we can support that, right? So Robert, if he wants to connect with a different client but to the same database, again, he's using the same account, he's connecting to the same database, just using a different client, he could go here and do connect with and select Toad. Again, same look and feel. We'll launch the recorded session. It'll notify the user it's being recorded, pass in the credentials automatically, and he's sitting at his client of choice, which is now Toad. So he'd rather connect to that database and manage it with this UI instead of SQL Plus, right? And it's all a preference thing for a lot of your DBAs, but we can support that as well. We also have the ability here to map drives over. So if your users, you can determine, right, on a policy basis. So you can say whether or not the user has the ability to map his local drive over to this system. And if he does, he'd have the ability to do file open, and he could open things from his local system, almost identical to him being connected to his local system, but you have a full audit record of why he's utilizing that shared credential. And you know, I think I've emphasized on this call a lot that it's shared credential or protecting and managing shared credential access. It doesn't always have to be. There are certain scenarios where we intentionally want to force people through a recorded type session like this so we have more control, and we're not going to use a shared credential, right? We're going to say any connection they make, whether it's their account or a shared credential, we're going to push through the PSM server, the Privileged Session Management Server. We're going to isolate that, control it, record it. And again, that may only be applicable for maybe your SOC's enclave of servers or maybe your PCI-specific servers or whatever that may be. So it doesn't necessarily just need to be within shared credentials, but that's primarily what we focus on are those privileged, very highly privileged built-in credentials. So we're getting close here to the top of the hour. I know there's a lot of information at once, so I want to leave the floor open for some questions. If there are none, we can definitely move on, and I've got a handful of other things I can show from a demonstration perspective, but I'd like to go ahead and maybe move it back over to Paul and see if we have any questions come in that we need to address in the call.
Hey, Andy, thanks so much. Greatly appreciate the presentation. Very, very well done, and Excellent. So we do actually have a few questions that are out there right now, so glad that we are able to spend some time with that. And if you do have questions and haven't submitted them yet, if you could just follow the normal protocol that we do on the webinar, you can send them directly to the iSecure LLC avatar, and we'll go from there. So first question that we have here is, what about brute force breach attempts? How would CyberArk work with that, or would you work with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good question. And I guess we can interpret that in a couple of different ways. Brute force breach attempts directly to the CyberArk vault. And my way of answering that is again, when we designed the CyberArk vaulting infrastructure, security was top of mind. We don't make sacrifices for usability in terms of security. It's always at the forefront of what we do. We have yearly penetration tests both internally and from a lot of our large customers. I didn't spend too much time on the customer slide. I don't like to brag or use that as a selling feature, but we have a lot of Fortune 50 and a lot of really big financial institutions that use this to protect their privileged credentials. So they're obviously very concerned with asserting the security of the vault infrastructure as a password repository. And then secondly, so brute force attacks from target systems, right? Maybe it's an edge environment or an edge network, or maybe it's a user's workstation. It's probably not our primary focus. I would say where we would attempt to kind of integrate with a workflow like that is if you did use a SIEM solution, and if the target that was being brute forced was sending events back to a SIEM solution, we could help kind of correlate whether or not that was being used from a privileged account. We could maybe insert a trigger to automatically change that password and make sure that that credential is rotated. We would also detect from a CyberArk perspective that that credential's been locked out, right? Again, if it's a brute force type attack and you have a lockout policy on the system, Windows for instance, maybe after 5 attempts, CyberArk would sense when that credential is locked out and could notify a user. In terms of actually talking directly to the target system and saying, hey, is somebody trying passwords too many times, that kind of communication is probably out of band. But again, I think we would lean back to the user framework of the target system to really implement your lockout policies and procedures for those accounts.
Great, excellent, excellent. Appreciate that. Another question that I have here is around the Web 2.0 applications, the Twitter and the Facebook modules that you're saying that you're protecting. Can you kind of give just a couple more minutes and kind of go into that a little bit? It seems like that's an issue that people are interested in. That I was hoping maybe you could address a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. And again, you know, the nature of the number of systems we integrate with, there's only so many I can show. So I did kind of browse right over that, but that's a really good question. So when we talk about systems we integrate with and systems we manage, or quote unquote integrate with, right, there's two facets that we typically look at. It's automatic password management, right? Can we automatically reach out to the target system and change the password? And it's also in session management. Can we launch a session and feed credentials in to automatically connect the user? And with web apps, we have a lot of controls to support whichever web app that you can bring to the table. Obviously, Twitter and Facebook have been big requests from customers, so that's one of the ones that we can definitely control. Even if, and I think it's worth noting here, even if they don't have external APIs or external methodologies to actually change the password, we can follow a scripted, more or less an HTML scripted workflow that navigates through those menus and clicks to change passwords manually through kind of the web UI. And those are plugins that we're consistently devoting effort and time to and making sure they're updated and up with the latest versions. In terms of automatic management, so if I wanted to, or sorry, automatically connecting the user through proxied sessions, again, we're logged in as John here, and if John wants to connect through to Twitter using the Twitter account, same look and feel here. If you haven't figured it out by now, we use remote desktop services as our platform for proxying. So it looks like the same login. He's notified that he's being recorded, and then again, automatically passed in. Probably should have looked at this before. I don't know who's following Justin Bieber on this Twitter account, but it automatically logged the end user in. So this kind of marketing scenario would be if this was your company presence, if this was your company Twitter, you could automatically log those folks in and pull a full session recording of exactly what happened, who posted what, and obviously those things will be attributed back to their AD username that they use to sign into the vault with. So yeah, along those lines, the two facets that we do in terms of system integration and account management, automatic password rotation is one, and then directly connecting the user to the session is another. We support both of those for these as well. To show really quickly what Amazon Web Services looks like. Amazon Web Services is also unique in the sense that it does offer a lot in terms of external APIs and external CLIs. So there's functions in here where, for example, we can use a Amazon Web Services key and connect the user through PowerShell automatically to Amazon Web Services to type in Web Services CLI type functions that spin up new VMs or turn down systems or backup systems or whatever it may be. So obviously if it's supported by the end platform, there's more integration levels that are possible. This scenario that I just showed here was him simply getting connected to the web UI to do backend management with this built-in account at Amazon Web Services.
Yeah, I think one of the examples that I've talked to Dan about, Dan Hacker is actually my counterpart at CyberArk, was I believe it was last year when the AP Twitter account was hacked, and I believe it was, somebody got credentials for that and put out the tweet that the White House was bombed and that Obama was seriously injured, and the ramifications of that, it wasn't, a funny joke and that was it, and everybody got a laugh out of it and said, wow, somebody was smart enough to do that. But the stock exchange actually just started dumping money based off the keywords that were used in the Twitter account. So that's how crazy we're tied into the Web 2.0 world, that the machines that were sitting on the stock exchange saw those string of words, White House bombing, Obama hurt, and just started dumping money. And you could actually see, if you want to Google it, anybody out there, it will show you the picture of what the stock exchange looked like for the 15 minutes that it was not confirmed or confirmed, and then when it was confirmed that it was a hoax, things kind of got back to normal. But being able to get to the credentials of a Twitter account is pretty interesting. So
yeah, that's a really valid point, and that's one of the examples we throw out a lot, Paul. That's it has real implications, like you said. There's actually money moving because of this hacktivist who thought it was a clever idea, and even beyond that, right? Even if it doesn't have a direct monetary implication, it still has brand implications,
sure,
and probably an indirect monetary implication. So yeah, it's something that people are putting a lot more effort into now, is really looking at securing those marketing presence.
Yeah. Soft costs are hard to budget for, so I hear you. So a couple more questions that we have here. I know we're coming up on the top of the hour, so I'll try to get through these quickly. There seems like there is a couple questions that are out here, and I'm going to actually go with this direct question from one of our participants, because it seems like it kind of captures everything and all. It's going to your example of John. So the question is here, any concerns that if John's domain credentials or computer gets compromised, that a bad guy has easy access to all systems that John does? Follow-up multi-factor authentication for John, and then has there been any consideration to using this as the interface in a training environment, then perhaps leveraging the monitoring capabilities as a performance-based assessment? So there are a couple questions that kind of lead along those lines. I thought that one was the best one read, so maybe you can touch on that a little bit.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So first of all, yes, definitely is a concern that that we put attention to and that we design towards. So yes, if John's credentials are specifically lost and somebody would gain access to this environment, they could potentially have access to the system. There's a couple controls that I'll discuss here that'll mitigate that in terms of a risk. One, I think you nailed it in the follow-up, dual-factor authentication. Definitely something you want to implore for a solution like this, as it does exactly right. It holds the keys to the kingdom. So John's credential now not only being compromised is gaining access to this as well. So we support RSA two-factor ID, secure auth. There's phone factor that'll actually call your phone and ask you to type in a PIN, and it hops over a radius channel. There is, smart card, PKI, right? There's a never-ending options for two-factor authentication, but definitely an approach here, and especially for your users that have more of the administrative level or visibility to more of the highly privileged accounts within the organization. So for example, let's say you deploy this to use help desk credentials for your help desk environment, and they actually have access to local administrator accounts just on users' workstations. So that's pretty common. They'll use a local administrator account to troubleshoot if the domain, if the network's off or the machine's off the domain. But it may not be the most sensitive credentials. So for them, and maybe since they're very transactional in this, maybe we don't do two-factor authentication. But for another set of users, and you would determine this based on AD security group, right, if they lived in a different group. For another set of users, maybe the server operators that do have that level of access, we're going to enforce a second factor of authentication. So definitely really good question. I think that's one of the ways to mitigate it. A second would be, we didn't talk too much about this padlock here. This is actually what we call dual control. And in essence, it's manager approval. So for the accounts that you want to protect the most, you can put multiple levels of manager approval in line. So it wouldn't necessarily expose the credentials or allow the user to connect. Even if John's system was compromised, you'd have to go through a manager approval type workflow. With 8.6, our latest release, we introduced what we call multi-level. So you can say from this AD group, 2 people need to confirm, and in this AD group, 3 people need to confirm. And that's a model that some of our customers are leaning more towards with kind of a break glass fire call domain admin credential, right? You confirm it from 3 or 4 people, but there is the ability to gain access to that. And then, you know what? I've talked so long that I've forgotten the second. There was a second kind of question in that, Paul. Can you remind me of that one?
Sure, absolutely. Sure, absolutely. Yeah. It seemed like it was around it being a training component. So it says, has there been any consideration to using this as the interface into a training environment, and then perhaps leveraging the monitoring capabilities as a performance-based assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that was a really good question. There's some really interesting use cases that we use for PSM and session recording that we've seen in the wild, and a lot of these is obviously developed organically from our customers kind of using it, finding their niche. One of them is exactly that, right? It's there's a smaller IT shop specifically with a customer that I've worked with. It's a university. They use a lot of open source software. They're not heavily staffed from an IT perspective. And if they onboard a new guy, they'll say, hey, here's a video we've recorded on how to update the SQL database. So here's, you can go watch that video to learn how to update that database, right, for new IT staff. Or here's a video where we've actually, shown you how to install VMware tools on a VM. Go do that on these 30 VMs. And then even on the other side, right, exactly like you mentioned, we're almost a training and assessment, or an assessment tool to say, hey, would you log in here and do these specific tasks or perform these specific tasks, and then let me evaluate it based on that. Absolutely. I think that's a good use case. I haven't encountered that one, but I think it's a really good use case. Another really interesting one we didn't touch too much on was external contractors. So it's not uncommon for our customers to deploy this with the ability for external contractors to access it. It does a couple things. What it does is it removes the requirement for an external contractor to hold a highly privileged domain credential. So sometimes they'll say, yeah, we have to give this vendor or this contractor access to our network, and he needs domain access. Well, he may, but what if we were to proxy it through shared credentials? Then that way the credential that's floating out there in the wild, that's at somebody else's company, that's with another employee, that one has really limited access and just access to CyberArk. And once he gets access to CyberArk, then we can proxy his access to other systems. And it also, the second thing it also does is there's a lot of, maybe you get into a monetary dispute about how many hours were spent, and the contractor comes back and says, hey, we spent 48 hours this weekend repairing the system. And you can say, well, you know what, I only show that you were connected to this system for 2 hours Saturday morning. So obviously you can help settle some disputes with that as well. So yeah, really good question, and some interesting use cases that have kind of developed organically from some of our customer uses. But yeah, that's a good question.
Great, yeah, and not to beat the close to 10-month-old dead horse to death, but the contractor was the big piece in the target breach. So that's an interesting component to that as well. So very good answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So last question that I have here, and again, thank you so much for sticking with us, everybody, as we're going a little bit over the hour. Is there was in the UI. Someone saw a request for, it was a request view / incoming request area. Just briefly, if you could touch on what that is used for.
Yeah, you know what, so I think we did actually just touched on that. I didn't probably before they asked their question. But with this little padlock here, so a request is required, that is a manager approval function. It's a manager approval feature. And like I said, within 8.6, our latest release, we just released the ability to do multi-level manager approval. So you can say level 1 needs to approve first, and it's somebody from this group and I need 2 people to approve from that group, and then it moves to level 2, et cetera. They probably saw that feature right here on my screen, my request and incoming requests. So those are used to group requests that you've originated to use an account, or if you have the feature or the permission to be an approver, it would show you your incoming requests as well. So if you're a data owner or a manager or an approver, you would see those come in through your incoming requests. Some things that we didn't mention around that are that would actually generate emails. We integrate with SMTP server, obviously locally on your network, to send out emails to notify either approvers or approvees when changes have happened with that request. And then we also have a mobile rendering of this website as well, that your users, let's say they're in a meeting, they need to approve a request because it's urgent, they can log on to the mobile UI of the CyberArk interface here and log on and approve that request mobily. So another option there. But yeah, that's exactly what those two fields are for, incoming requests.
Great, excellent. And I believe that is it for the questions. So great questions, everybody. This was fantastic. Again, this has been a great week for interaction, and it seems like you guys are getting a lot out of it, so greatly appreciated for the interaction piece. And Andy, again, wonderful presentation. As you can see from the technology that CyberArk has and the use cases that are out there and the overall competency when it comes to information security and protection, you can see why iSecure has aligned ourselves strategically with the folks at CyberArk, and we're very grateful for that partnership that we have with them. So I know that there'll be some trinkets and some information that's following up that will be coming out to you in the next few weeks, and if there's any interest in talking more about them, you can reach out to the folks here at iSecure, and we'll help coordinate discussions for you. But other than that, thank you so much again, Andy, for coming in and pitching in, and everybody else, we'll see you at 2 p.m. this afternoon. Thank you.
Great.